Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon, and I'm the CEO and co-founder with Impetus Digital. If you're not familiar with Impetus, we offer numerous cutting-edge synchronous and asynchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools for life science companies. And we're helping them with all kinds of different digital services for things like virtual advisory boards, working groups, co-author teams, medical education, internal meetings, and corporate events. But most importantly, at Impetus, we believe that all great new ideas start with a conversation. And our online collaboration platform is the perfect place for not only starting these conversations, but also for continuously building on the ideas and insights that are generated over time, and also creating authentic partnerships and relationships with the participants in the process. So having these big, courageous conversations is how we believe we can start to implement change collectively to positively disrupt healthcare. So with all of that said, the idea behind this webinar series is to start the conversation around these ideas and to discuss these opportunities with the provocateurs, the leading edge thinkers, the digital entrepreneurs, around the issues that the healthcare industry is facing today, and determining how we can all work together with technology to incite change. So I'm really excited to have one of these digital entrepreneurs at the table today. I'd like to introduce to you John Leombruno. He's the CEO of a company called OkRx. He is actually formally trained as a pharmacist, and he earned his MBA from the Queen's University and received a PhD in pharmacoepidemiology from the University of Toronto. John has a very varied background. It included everything from practicing pharmacy in the retail and hospital setting, as well as had achieved increasing senior roles in direct patient care and management. He has executive level experience in many different areas in the pharmaceutical industry, including having worked in market access, medical information, pharmacovigilance, medical affairs, as well as business development. He co-founded a company called Patient Direct. This was a pharmaceutical services firm that provided patient support, prescription, and consulting services to the pharmaceutical industry, which was apparently acquired by McKesson Canada in 2010. So he went on to co-found another company called GMD Distribution. This was a pharmaceutical distribution firm that provided 3PL distribution services and patient support services, which also was acquired by McKesson Canada in 2017. So I'm sure you're best friends, John, with McKesson. So welcome, John. So happy to have you on the show.
Thanks so much, Natalie, for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. So what an interesting and varied professional journey. I'd love to get an overview from you about starting off as a pharmacist, becoming an entrepreneur, selling companies, and just continually co-founding them. What was that route like, and how did you end up where you are today?
Well, I wouldn't have been able to predict it if you asked me when I started. So my first job was it was in a rural community called Grimsby, just outside of Hamilton. And actually, the pharmacy that I worked at was inside a medical clinic that was inside like a heritage home. So it was like a home that was converted to a medical clinic. And it was typical small town pharmacy. So when I went to the supermarket, I knew half the people at the supermarket. They were all checking out what I was buying. And it was a great place to develop my clinical practice skills, being so closely knit with the healthcare team that was situated in this house. And while I was working there, we had a local Woco in the town. And when Walmart came to town, that Woco shut down. And I had no idea what was happening inside the Woco, but they had a pharmacy in there that was servicing nursing homes. And so the nursing homes in the area ended up choosing our pharmacy to service their nursing home prescription needs. And so my small town rural pharmacy quickly turned into like a distribution operation where we were doing tons of prescriptions. And it was really the first time I began to understand the business aspect of pharmacy and so forth. So I was there for a few years, and I learned how to manage the financials, how to manage large groups of employees and complex processes. And I took that experience and I moved to the hospital for sick children. And while I was there, once again, my eyes were open because of such a different practice environment. And that was basically like the late 90s, the early 2000s. And it was really when the biologics were being introduced and all the specialty pharmaceuticals. And I witnessed the profound effect that some of these drugs were having on our young patients, like literally transforming their lives. And I can remember a few kids who were like wheelchair bound. And after being treated with these new medications, were able to walk after a few months. So it had a pretty profound effect on me. And while I was there, we witnessed the standard of care change from we're going to surgically fuse these patients' joints to we're going to treat them with these new miracle drugs. And at the time, those drugs were basically Enbrel and Remicade. So I started to get involved with helping these patients access and obtain funding. And at that point in time, there was huge sticker shock with these drugs because they were like the first crop of drugs that were coming in at $20,000, $30,000 a year. And through my efforts, I eventually got hired by Shearing to help them with their strategy to get Remicade funded and to develop places where the drug can be administered. And I did that for a few years. And after that, I started to consult for other companies as these drugs were becoming more prevalent, and a lot of companies were launching them. And as I was out there, I was kind of figuring out that there's probably a better way that this can get done and a more efficient way. And that's when I started Patient Direct. And so we started with running patient support programs. We had specialty pharmacies, and we were investing in infusion clinics. And like you said, we eventually sold that to McKesson and worked at McKesson for a few years and kind of saw how a large multinational company would run that type of business. And then when I left McKesson, I kind of got the bug to do it again. And we started GMD Pharma Solutions, which was the same type of company, but instead of focusing on the biologics in inflammatory disease, we were focused on the ophthalmology specialty market. That kind of took me to where I am today at OkRx. After a few years working at McKesson, I kind of saw the writing on the wall in terms of how our entire industry was working. And I have a stat that I always quote. It's in 2017, the company that I owned, we sent out 210,000 faxes. And we were like the 5th largest player in that market. So maybe we had like a 10%, 15% market share. So, maybe 1/5 to 1/10 of the faxes that were going through. So that grosses up to like about 2 million faxes being sent just to support specialty medications just in Canada. And that was about, 3-4 years ago. And I'm pretty sure the situation hasn't changed much today. And that sort of led me to believe that there's probably a better way to do this.
Absolutely. It's just absolutely amazing. And to think also about how a large cohort of the population probably doesn't even know what a fax machine is. It really shows you the discordance of the various people that live in the society today. So let's actually talk about OkRx. You've obviously had a ton of learnings through both of your previous companies, and then the purchase through McKesson and learning how a big company was going to take it and modify it and optimize it, et cetera. So what is OkRx doing today? What is the business model, and why are you doing things differently?
Well, I mean, if you take just the whole analogy of the number of faxes, or the story about the number of faxes, and just how little things have changed over the last, let's call it 10 years in the specialty prescription market, and you kind of contrast that with how technology has changed our lives over the last 5 years, and you think about companies like Amazon and Uber, DocuSign, Zoom, so online banking, like those things dramatically affected a lot of businesses, but a lot of that change really hasn't come to the specialty business or the specialty drug business. And so I just wanted to sort of take some of the learnings that we learned from other industries to make things more efficient and bring it to specialty drugs and to see if we can make a go at it. And that was basically the idea. And when you work for a large company, because at the time I was working at McKesson, and it's just hard in a company that's that big and has so many employees to have that type of profound change. I mean, they invest millions of dollars in their current technology. And it's not just the technology and the software that they've invested in, because if you have, in our division had about just under 1,000 employees, just to shift those 1,000 employees to a new system is like incredibly expensive and risky. And so probably wasn't the best environment to start this venture and to start this process. And it's definitely a lot easier to start from a clean slate, and hence here we are with OkRx.
So you become the seed or the pilot project, and then they just invest in your pilot project to bring it in-house.
Well, I mean, yeah, because there's a lot of risk up front, by buying a company that's established a new process or a new way of doing things, you kind of weed out that risk, right? In larger companies, and we're just singling out McKesson, but they're kind of all the same, have a hard time with doing things in a new way, simply because they're established in their current ways and they have so much invested and so much on the line.
Absolutely. So one of the things that OkRx is specializing in is really determining what the patient experience is with a medication. So can you draw for us in a typical way, what is it that OkRx is doing from kind of inception of when you're sort of first touching a customer, and what you want that experience journey to look like, and what's the output? Can you explain what that customer journey looks like in a typical, again, everybody has their own unique, customized, precision focused viewpoint, but do you have some sort of an explanation about what that journey looks like?
Well, I think you're bang on in that the journey is going to be very different for different therapeutic areas and for different patient types. But I took my inspiration from, I guess, the way I use technology today. And so it's, for example, when you order something from Amazon, I know for myself, like I'm sitting around the kitchen table, ask my family what they want, go sit on the couch in the living room, put your order through, and you don't think much of it. And even now, like if you've bought a house and you're using a realtor lately, that process is pretty simple. Like it's simple, it's easy. You don't have a place to go to do all this work. You just do it where you are when you feel like doing it. And that's the type of feeling that I wanted to bring to the patient support program process. Now, some of that's hard to draw a parallel with, because obviously you just can't sit at home and say, hey, I'd like to join a patient support program and be on these drugs. So you have to work within the realities that these drugs are prescribed by physicians and so forth. But once we do connect to the patient, the goal would be to have it to be as familiar and as comfortable as using some of the apps that we all use today.
Brilliant. So I see on your website that you do have this entry point, right? So as we think about the client avatar, you have healthcare providers, and we can talk about some of the other people that use your services, and then there's obviously the patients. So I'm a patient with a condition. Okay, let's just say, for example, it's somebody who maybe I have breast cancer. So what do I do when I'm first faced with your website? What is it that I get to look for? I know that you have a database and a search engine. So tell us a little bit about what that first touch point looks like for a patient coming to your website.
We have a few different paths, and probably the path that makes the most sense to talk about is the path where the physician, in this case, the prescriber, or the person in that team who directs the patient to say, hey, here's an app that's going to start this process off for you. And today that contrasts with, let's sign you up with a paper-based form. Now, paper-based forms are incredibly important. So as a company, we can't show a blind eye to that. And we do have a solution for paper-based forms. But in that scenario where it's appropriate that the sponsor, so the pharma company and the PSP program, feel that it's appropriate that patients can self-enroll, and then we would then at that point say, hey, let's try to do that on an app. So there would be a patient app where the patient would simply get the code or get the direction from their prescriber to go to the app. They would download the app and they would start the enrollment process. And that process would start at that point in time. And then basically the information that they put into the app gets flowed into the CRM. And then at that point, the situation, the process becomes a little bit more traditional, like typically, because we have rules with our sponsors, the pharma companies, that certain things have to happen at certain points in time. So whatever we can flow digitally, we do, but sometimes you can't flow something digitally because we have some certain requirement that we need to make, then we would flip out into the traditional system. So in that scenario, what we're trying to do when we engage with the patient is kind of create a familiar environment, something like they've seen in many patient apps to start the process of engagement, to then see if there's work that gets flowed through the patient to the patient, they can flow it through the app and they can do it on the app. Versus today, you might get an unsecured email. Not too many patients get faxes, but I know in my last company, we sent out enough mail to drive you crazy. So to kind of take all those processes and digitize them to make them available when the patient's ready for them. And then to have all of the bells and whistles around that to remind people when things are due, when things aren't done, when to follow up, when to escalate, so forth.
Very interesting. So what you've actually done in a lot of ways is you've just taken that front end and you've digitized it, as opposed to the very awkward sort of like you said, paper-based, and that's kind of like the first foray into the digital revolution. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, John, have you found that the uptake or the acceptance of that initial digital enrollment has been accelerated and there's a greater acceptance by pharma companies?
Well, I mean, we started post-COVID, so it's hard to compare and contrast our experience, but obviously I've been around in the industry. And I think that being such a highly regulated industry, there's definitely more conversations now, but we're still convincing people to take that step. So it's not a given or a no-brainer by any means at this point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree. So, so what's interesting here, though, is we've talked about that digitization and getting that initial experience of people kind of enrolling. Now, obviously, people are being enrolled because they're on a certain type of medication. They're seeing their doctor for a specific type of condition, so they're already on a track. Does the system, once they enroll, does it already triage people based on the drug that they're taking so that they're on that very specific drug patient support program? Or are they also in unison being given other more generic programs that multiple companies are investing in? What is that? What is the long-term plan for creating a much more seamless experience for patients? So it may not necessarily feel like it's just from a drug, but it's more condition-based.
Yeah, I mean, right now, I guess our apps and what we're doing would be an entry point into the traditional sort of brand-based patient support program. And if you look at that, I mean, that's traditionally what pharma's been willing to fund, because obviously they have a mandate of making sure that their drugs are easy to access for patients. We've had a few discussions with people who are looking beyond just branded programs and looking at therapeutic area programs. But at the end of the day, the funding envelope for those programs typically still resides with pharma. There's no other place or no other stakeholders who are willing to step up and to fund those types of projects right now. So I think my gut feeling is that for the next little while, the services like mine and programs like ours are going to be doing kind of the same thing, which is directing people into the traditional type of programs where those programs are addressing the needs of the patient on a certain brand or a certain group of brands.
And as people are coming into these brand specific programs, so they're, traditionally we've seen these PSPs being a series of mailers. It's almost like a series of touch points of reminders and new knowledge. And, ultimately there's ideas around adherence and other sorts of things. What is the pharma companies benefiting from of having patients enrolling in their specific patient support programs?
Yeah, well, I think just out the gate, many of these drugs are challenging to obtain. I mean, some are easy and they're, the path to reimbursement or coverage is simple, but most of them have a little bit of a convoluted path. And when the patient leaves the physician's office, there's uncertainty of what's going to happen. And so that's the biggest barrier and usually the biggest reason for a lot of these programs is to make sure that the patients are assessed from a reimbursement perspective and that a full assessment is done. And then if there is no coverage afterwards, then the companies would feel a lot better about providing compassionate or other types of free drug, knowing that the patient truly does not have any sources of reimbursement. So that's always job number one. And getting patients on therapy quickly and efficiently is probably the number one reason that pharma companies would end up supporting these programs. So it's kind of like the hierarchy of needs. Once you got a patient on your program and they're on the drug and they're doing well, then the focus shifts from that to education. So a lot of times we're doing education in our CRM. We actually have modules that manages the education and ensures it's documented appropriately and so forth. And those, to make sure that the patients know about potential side effects, how to manage those side effects and so forth. And then probably the third one is adherence. Because when patients ultimately end up feeling and doing better, that's when they forget to take their medications. And so I see a hierarchy of needs there. And every therapeutic area and every drug has a different set of needs based on the realities that they're facing. But those would be the big three buckets. And as you go further down into, the types of services that programs provide. So then you're looking at if a drug needs to be administered, then there's got to be administration coordination. That's a hassle and something that, you know, is probably being done today in companies the same way it was done like the late 90s, versus if you think about even the last 2 years with physicians, like it's been amazing how the physician environment or just the clinic environment has changed from, you used to have to call and, you know, wait on the phone for 10 minutes to get someone at your doctor's office, whereas now you just get an email saying, here's 3 dates or 3 times, pick the one you want, right? So it's stuff like that that needs to evolve. And then the final piece is just coordination of services required for patients. And a lot of times this is just to help the physician out because prescribing some of these drugs is complicated. For example, you might need a lot of tests. And if you look at the anti-TNFs, like there's TB testing, maybe fecal calprotectin testing, so forth. Those types of tests, if they're not done at the beginning, could affect the patient's reimbursement status in a year from now. And so you can get on the drug today and everything's okay, but then in a year when they say, hey, how has this level changed? If you don't have the baseline level, it's a problem. So then you can kind of work in services like that into the patient support program. So those are, you know, in a bucket, kind of most of the types of things that patient support programs are doing today.
And as the pharma company, because again, the important piece has to do with the regulatory, the compliance around, and also around privacy and security of patient data. So only certain things can be conveyed back to the sponsoring pharma company. So nothing that would be specifically patient generated or anything that would be really granular at a patient level. But what sorts of metrics are provided by programs and companies like yourself back to the pharma company? At the end of the day, they are manufacturers, they're for-profit companies, and they do these things in order to generate a profit. So they want to have patients come into their programs, have the, you know, be able to adhere and maintain on their drugs, and to be able to have obviously positive patient outcomes, but also this results in profits for the company. So what sorts of metrics does your company provide back to the pharma companies so they can determine that investing in programs like yours, there's a return on their investment?
For sure. And so we have a whole menu of KPIs. And again, each company has their own take on what's appropriate KPIs and what would be appropriate for a certain brand and so forth. But like some of the most common ones are like time to first contact with the patient. And this would be for like a traditional program where you're sitting there waiting for a fax. The companies want to know that if the fax comes in, you know, Monday at 3 o'clock, that you're calling that patient within a certain amount of time. Actually, I have a funny anecdote. We had one client who and this was when I was in the business of actually managing support programs. Today, we just do CRMs that help the providers do that. But we had a client who was looking for a 1 hour. So we want you to call the patient within 1 hour of receiving the fax. And so you staff your team accordingly and you set up your workflows so that you can achieve that. And what we were finding is like almost all the time, we're calling the patient like when they're walking out of the physician's office or in the elevator or walking to their car. And, you know, that's not a great experience for the patient because almost, you know, all the time in that scenario, you're calling them back at another point in time. But it just goes to show you how granular the KPIs can be. And so that's a common one. And there's also time to like when you first submit their prior authorization, the time the prior authorization comes back, the time to when they get their first either bridging or compassionate dose to their first commercial dose. So there's a lot of different metrics that a lot of the companies would track. And one of the unique things about our system is when we track the metrics, when the patient, or I guess when the data misses the mark, in our system, we would have a screen pop up that says, okay, you've missed the mark here. And what is the reason? And by doing that in real time, at the point when the operator or the user realizes that they've missed the mark, you get a lot more robust data than kind of looking at a report at the end of the month and saying, okay, what happened here, and trying to piece it all together.
Fantastic. So when we said that, you know, the patient has actually gone through the enrollment process after being introduced to it by their physician or their prescriber, then there's a whole piece that you said of even just getting access to the drug. Mm-hmm. And as we know in Canada, this is not just a Canadian issue, it's across the globe, but in particular with Canada, it can be an incredibly convoluted process, especially for expensive biologics and, you know, all of these newfangled types of drugs that we are creating on a regular basis, and they're expensive and they're difficult to access. And there's a whole issues around disparities in payment from provinces. So what is a patient experience like? Do they go into this with this idea that they may not get the drug, that they will get the drug, that there's going to be a time lock? What's communicated to them? And tell us, lead us through the sort of the specific market access piece, the different steps that is going on in front of the patient and also behind the scenes at OkRx.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the first thing that happens is that there's some type of discussion that the physician would have with the patient at the point of prescription. And that could be the physician themselves, or it could be someone in their support staff. And I think there's a wide dichotomy of realities based on certain molecules. So in some molecules, and even though they're biologics and they're expensive, in certain therapeutic indications, I think there's a lot of certainty that the person, be it the prescriber or the support staff, would be able to tell the patient this is most likely what's going to happen. And then there's other therapeutic areas where it's like literally you leave that knowing that something's going to happen, but you really have no clue of the outcome. And things are, and so when something's publicly funded, I think things are a lot more clear versus when there's not adequate public funding for a certain medication. And so when there's not public funding and you're kind of relying on the private insurers at that point, it's really challenging, because even if you as a physician or a support person knew that, let's say, Sun Life covered a certain drug, the reality is that Sun Life has hundreds or maybe even thousands of different group plans. Even within a group plan, sometimes some groups, like let's call it the executive team, would have access to certain medications that let's call it like the starting positions wouldn't. So knowing is really challenging. You might know that you need to fill out a form, but even then, some within Sun Life or with any insurer, some groups require a prior authorization form and some don't. And so it's hard to know and hard to start that process off and give the patient any certainty. And that's really why these programs exist, because if there was certainty, then probably the need for the programs would be pretty reduced. So at that point, I'm assuming that the patient is informed that, hey, we're going to figure things out. Some programs have pretty comprehensive, compassionate or bridging processes. And so in that scenario, the patient can have access to free drug if they enroll into the program while things are getting figured out. And then you have to sort of figure out, is that a bridge to something that's sustainable, or is it just free drug for a month or two while things are getting figured out? And other programs can sort of wait and say, hey, let's do the whole reimbursement evaluation first before we discuss anything about free drug or bridging drug, anything like that. So you can see that that's pretty, it's quite a lot of anxiety. And that's why the patient programs are there. So once the operator ends up connecting to the patient live one-on-one, they can sort of walk them through all of that and start the process. And if you look at even the first step in a lot of these processes, you call the insurance company, make sure that a prior auth is needed. And for a lot of specialty medications, it is indeed the case. Then you go ahead and you get the form that needs to get filled out. And then you start the whole process of filling out that form. And for someone who hasn't seen the forms, and some of them are like 8-9 pages long. And one of the things that strikes me about the forms is that there's really not one person in the circle of care who can fill out that form. If you take someone will be like, well, tell us all about the patient support program you're in. Tell us about so you can say, okay, well, the physician may not know that information, may not know all the other patient support programs the patient is, may not know who their agent at the patient support program is, and so forth. Then some other questions, tell us about the plan holder. Well, the physician and their team, they wouldn't really know that, so they have to ask the patient. Then there's other questions about, tell us all of the different drugs you've been on. And, I've been involved with some therapeutic areas where that's super important, because that's the way the pharma companies, that's the way the insurers are mitigating, making sure that they're not paying appropriately. But in many therapeutic areas, when you go see the specialist who's going to prescribe these drugs, they don't have your full detailed history. They hear from you that you might, or from the patient that they failed this and failed that. They might have a consult note that gives them some degree of knowledge there. But at the end of the day, when you're submitting those forms to some insurers, they're checking the dates, right? And you say, okay, were you on this for 2 years? And give us the beginning date and the end date and the average dose and so forth. So it really becomes a community effort on filling out those forms. And if you ever tried to fill out a PDF form, where everyone's handwriting on it as a community effort, it's pretty challenging. And that's one of the things that we do, is we digitize those forms. So it allows us to pass those forms digitally around to all of the stakeholders, including the patient, so that they can put their information on it. Because it really is team and sort of community effort to get all of that different type of information, because there's not really one person who kind of knows it all.
So in this process, which sounds like a very traditionally convoluted process, you've digitalized it and you've got a vetting automation workflow system so that the physician or whoever the other stakeholders involved with that particular patient are notified of what's going on with the decision, specifically on that piece, which is the access, the prior authorization, everything else. Is that what I'm hearing you say that your system does?
Yeah, well, that's probably like one of the corner pieces of our system, is that it allows that form to be shared with all of those stakeholders that I mentioned. I didn't mention pharmacy in there, but pharmacy as well, and allows the owner of the form, and typically the owner is going to be at the PSP, to send that form out to different people, collect information electronically so the form starts to fill up and gets populated. And then at certain points in time, when it's appropriate, the PSP can then trigger the signature. So you obviously don't want the doctor to sign the form if it's all blank. And so allows the PSP or whoever the owner is, doesn't have to be a PSP, could be like a drug access navigator, whomever it needs to be, would be able to quarterback that through to completion. And then when it's submitted, and as those different kind of, let's say, call them milestones are reached within the form, then all of the stakeholders get notified, hey, we've gotten to this point, we've gotten to this point, and so forth. And at the end, it gets submitted to whoever it needs to get submitted to, typically an insurance company. And then kind of everyone waits and to, in all patient support programs, they all have an algorithm. If it's Green Shield, we're going to call every 3 days. If it's, Sun Life, we're going to call every 5 days, whatever their algorithm is. And they wait for the outcome of that form to be communicated. And then everyone gets updated.
Very interesting. So I'm going to linger on a couple of those things because there's a lot of appendages and pieces and parts to that, and lots of interesting questions I have for it. So there's obviously some kind of a mastermind behind it. Ultimately, we're going to look for some gigantic, cool AI algorithm that's going to mastermind all of it. Maybe we're going to get there soon. But right now, there's probably some kind of humanoid who's managing this complexity per patient. So those humans that are kind of masterminding and kind of keeping the oversight on all of this, are these people that are within the OkRx community? Is it external people? Like, I know that Alan Birch has a group called, Drug Access. They're drug navigators in Canada who do this kind of work. How does that masterminding piece work, and who is the stakeholders that get involved?
Yeah, well, right now, the majority of all of our stakeholders are people who work in PSPs. And so we give them access to the tool, and they're quarterbacking the process. And that works well for drugs that are supported by patient support programs. There's also a cohort of people who, for whatever reason, do not want to refer their patients to patient support programs, and that exists. And there's also a whole slew of drugs where the economics just don't make sense. For example, you have some prior authorization drugs that might be $600, $700, $800, let's call it every few months. And you can't spend, at that price point, you can't spend money on reams of people to quarterback this. And so in those scenarios, our plan is to put that technology into the hands of, like you said, the access coordinators, the office coordinator, whoever it happens to be. So, for us to engage them first would have been a little bit challenging, because it's hard to go out and find them as like a company with limited resources like we have. It's hard to go out and find them, but we knew that if we went to the PSP program, like sitting in that office and where the 100 people on the program sit, they all do that all day, every day. So that was our first sort of connection, to work with them, to get our beta out there, to test it, to make sure we fully understand how it was going to work. And then eventually see how can we make this work for people who are not in a patient support program, because one doesn't exist for that molecule.
Fantastic. And so what does this look like at the end of the day? Is this, I know you mentioned this is an app on a patient's phone, but we also realize that in the clinic, as it relates to to the actual prescriber, they have their electronic health records and their computers in the clinic. There's the nurses who are looking at the same thing. There's the pharmacist looking at their computers, and all of these various stakeholders. Is there like a single portal entry that you log in, you click on the patient's identifier, and then you can find out where everything is in this workflow system?
I mean, sort of. It doesn't actually work like that, because what happens is someone starts a form. And again, right now that's PSP employees, but it could be anybody. And they invite the stakeholders to collaborate on that form. And so you can't just go looking for a form, you kind of have to be invited on a form by form basis. And so what happens is, as that person starts the form, maybe let's just say it's a pharmacist in a pharmacy, and he's sitting at the pharmacist or she's sitting at the pharmacy terminal, comes up rejected, patient needs a prior authorization. Well, in that scenario, it's appropriate for them to start the form. And they would start the form, and they could fill it as much as they potentially could. And they would say, okay, well, now I need the patient. And some forms need the patient's signature, or it gets more crazy. Sometimes they need the patient and the plan holder's signature, and some forms don't. So you kind of have to, as you said, this master humanoid needs to be smart and understand the process, because you just can't be sending this out everywhere to people to get signatures if you don't need to. But you would then say, okay, well, if the patient needs to sign this, I'll get the patient to fill out these 3 or 4 pieces of information and they can sign it. And now we got like the first section of the form done, and then I can send it to the physician and they can sign and fill out the information that they need to do. And when after they've signed it, now the second section is done, and now we can send it to the insurance company. So definitely, by all means, are people invited to participate in that form when they're required, and it's kind of done on an as-needed basis based on who's owning that form.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. You also mentioned, I guess some branding, if you will, to this methodology or technology on your website, which you call AMART Path AI, and also Quick Path. Can you explain a little bit about what that process or that methodology is?
Yeah, so that's outside of our, what we just talked about there was our kind of form filling technology. And that's like we plan to make that available to everyone. But those technologies that we spoke about that you mentioned have to do with, once you use our CRM to support a patient support program, we have a lot of different algorithms that looks at, and we start off with, you have to kind of go into the screen and click off all of the things you want clicked off as a starting point. But over time, as you enter information into the system, it starts to learn, for lack of a better word. And so you might have a scenario where, hey, for Green Shield, we, 99% of the time we need to use this form. And so if you're going through the Green Shield process in our CRM and you're not using the form, maybe the system will ping you and say, hey, you should do this, right? Or gives a warning to the user that, hey, this is kind of what's been required in the past. And as the information builds and grows, it allows the PSP employees and PSP management to make better and better procedures and more efficient procedures. And that, a lot of times, that information is presented to the user right when they're collecting it. So as soon as the patient tells me they have Green Shield, or they've sent me a copy of their Green Shield card and I go to enter it into the system's starting to tell me what they think the next steps should be.
Fantastic. That's brilliant. And like many, many moons ahead of anything that we have today. So that's really great use of machine learning, which is fantastic. So we're kind of moving along here in the patient journey. Let's just say, for example, we've gone through all of that form filling and everything worked out, and insurance company or the public system is paying for it. This patient is now on their medication. We're now moving into the flow around consistent education and, I guess, adherence reminders. What exactly is going on for the patient at this point, and where are these other stakeholders, i.e. the physician, nurses, pharmacists, other allied healthcare providers, sitting on the periphery through this experience?
Yeah, and as we get into these processes, they're much more regulated, as you can imagine. I mean, if your client is a pharmaceutical company, the second you start to talk about, hey, we're going to talk to the patient about this, you're already talking about, okay, well, let's look at what you're going to say. Show me the approved scripts. What happens when someone asks a question? What are you going to respond to? And so the reality is that in many scenarios, when you're going down these education programs or adherence programs, it's a highly scripted, highly regulated process. And in one case, that's a good thing, because as a pharma company, you want to make sure that no one's doing anything that you wouldn't want them to be doing. In other cases, it kind of it's not perfect for the patient, because not all patient is going to fit your script perfectly. So for us, our system, what it does is it goes through the algorithm to evaluate the time points, the types of communication, and when I say communication, the messages that are going to be delivered, how it wants to be delivered. Are you going to do a text? Are you going to do an email? Are you going to do a phone call? So that's kind of where we're at today. And the reality is probably will be working like this for at least the next few years, just simply because the person who's approving this and paying for this needs that rigidity to make sure that they're on the mark with all of their regulations.
So when we talk about regulation, certainly we realize that this is going to be here forever and a day because there's a lot of sensitivity around patient privacy, security, and certainly we can't make the same mistakes where you do in tech, where you basically get to fail fast and jump up and pivot. These are patients' lives that we're talking about. So it's not really the same thing. Having said that, we realize that things can be turned on its head if pushed to the wall. And we've seen that with some very, very acrobatic moves that, for example, Health Canada has made in terms of pushing forward on approvals of vaccines that we've never seen the speed at which this has happened. And we've seen a lot of other things happening very quickly in terms of quick access to supply chains and all kinds of other activities. So with all of that said, and the acceleration, the adoption of technology we're seeing happening more and more rapidly every day, what are some of the regulatory things that you foresee happening that will have some direct application to what you're doing?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not smart enough to see the crystal ball on how the regulations are going to change to sort of meet the realities of what technology is capable of today. So I think what we're really realistically going to see is how can you take the current technology and make it compliant. So things like if you're using apps and you're using chatbots and so forth, how can they be compliant given the current rules? So I think that's realistically what's going to happen over the next little while. And I can see companies making investments, companies like mine making investments in automating a lot of things, but still, as you're automating a lot of things, you're thinking about what the rules and regulations are. If you were to get audited, how would you show that every patient experienced this versus that? All those types of things that pharma companies are really have their eye on. I think where there's potential for change, and some of the things that we're trying to do as a company is that a lot of these processes today, they exist because pharma has paid for them and pharma has brought them to the market or to the industry. But a lot of stuff that we're trying to do is to bring the tools to physicians and prescribers and the stakeholders, like the healthcare providers. And not to say that they don't have rules. Of course, they have lots of rules, but the rules are framed in a much different perspective, where it's more about what's best for the patient versus did we cross all of our I's, cross all of our T's and dot all of our I's. So one of the things, like one of our systems, really the purpose of it is to give it to the actual providers, so typically pharmacists and prescribers who are doing some of this work. And if they begin to engage it, then the tools and the interesting things that we would like to do might become a little bit easier to actually achieve, simply because we're not bound by the rules that would bind a lot of the common PSP interactions that occur today.
And mainly because of how they're being directly funded currently, or how you're
Correct.
being currently funded. So here's actually just, at a curiosity, just to throw this out as a possibility. Traditionally, patients have been prescribed chemical drugs, right? I mean, that's just what we talk about. We're talking about pills. But we're seeing more and more, and again, there's been robust changes, the FDA, Health Canada, in Europe, with NICE, et cetera, around things like approvals of software as medical devices. And there's all kinds of things happening at an app level where so much, not even it's just direct to consumer, they're actually going through clinical trials. These are going up against standards of care and actual practice around being compared to chemical entities. Is there a possibility that a company like OkRx could partner with them as another potential, joint partner who funds, and there's an intervention point in the patient journey where they'd be utilizing these apps as something that helps to improve the overall outcome for them?
Yeah, absolutely. And we haven't had discussions with those types of companies, but we definitely had discussions with like medical device companies. But at the end of the day, if you want to have a successful company that helps patients get on therapy, I mean, that's exactly what you do. It doesn't matter what the therapy is, if it's a digital therapy or a device or a pharmaceutical therapy. So absolutely, it would be something that we would be highly interested in. Hasn't really come across our desk yet, but we would definitely be interested and excited actually to work on something along those lines.
Since the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a lot of discussion around the decentralization of clinical trials. Unfortunately, at the time, a lot of trials that were not as resilient and were still relying on a lot of in-person reporting and assessments and diagnostics had to stop abruptly. And then they had to completely pivot and change what they were assessing. Is there an opportunity for companies like OkRx to potentially start looking for other revenue streams as becoming almost part and parcel of CROs or clinical trials, having patients enroll and helping to manage through that process? So it's not just about treatment, it's also about enrolling in clinical trials.
Yeah, I mean, we have not really contemplated that or had those discussions, but I know a lot of companies who are right there on that doorstep ready to do those types of things. And if you look at the advent, like think about all the companies that, when COVID hit, came to prominence, basically like the virtual care companies. So I think they're best poised to take on that challenge and to succeed at that. But definitely a huge opportunity for people and just a huge paradigm shift for how things are going to work over the next 4 to 5 years.
It'll be very interesting to see how that all plays out for sure. And I guess the other thing as well too is as we think about the patient experience, we're thinking about how they're interacting with their stakeholders, pharmacists, physicians, nurses. I know we're using the word wearables a lot of times, but there's this idea of how patients are being monitored and managed in this new lockdown world. We don't even know in the future if this is going to be the new hybrid model where there's some visits that are required and the rest of it's going to be done through telemedicine. How is OkRx sort of managing and thinking about this, especially as it relates to specialty pharmacies, infusion clinics, visiting providers? I mean, what sorts of things are being considered as part of that patient management workflow that's going to cater to this new reality?
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely taken a partnership approach to that. And if you look at, just the way medicine and healthcare is administered, there's a lot of different, let's call it providers and processes out there that where people have real deep experience and expertise. And having one company do everything probably isn't going to work. And so when you look at the people who provide virtual care, there's a number of great companies out there who are doing that today. You would imagine that at some point they're going to have to start to expand, and they're not just going to be doing virtual interactions with patients. As they start to expand, we see a huge opportunity for us to be bolted on to what their experience is. And not just companies like us, but other companies who provide other sort of niche expertise services. And there's really going to be like a whole new, let's call it environment. I kind of call it like, it's going to be a whole new, like the Apple store, but it's going to be like the health store. And there's going to be some players who are pivotal, and they kind of like house all of the other players together. And I really see a market evolving where that ends up happening. And if you just look at like the Apple Store or the Google Play Store and the thousands and thousands of apps that are on there, it doesn't make sense for someone to say, hey, we're going to make the super app that does everything. You just want the one app that does it exactly the way you need it to do, and then you'll use that. And a lot of times that's all you need to do to be successful. So we kind of saw that starting with the EMR market. And if you look at the US, the EMR market's very different there, where there's a lot more interaction, a lot more, I call it democracy around EMR data. And we can see that in Canada, that's starting to happen now, where there's even companies that are specializing in, hey, build an app and then we'll get it attached to a bunch of EMRs for you. So I see that being really the way of the future, where there's going to be a couple of cornerstone players who then interact with hundreds of smaller players to get work done by companies that have the expertise in getting that work done.
I love it. It's this idea of like the digital app pharmacy, where basically physicians go and prescribe everything from drugs, apps to PSP programs. And I don't see that being too far away. But one of the key clinchers here has to do with interoperability. You just alluded to earlier that you're 1/10 of like the millions of faxes that are sent out, which is a scary prospect. But while we're still using fax machines, one has to ask the question of how are we going to, and how are we working on interoperability so that there's an integration with electronic health records and the systems that that the pharmacists are using and the systems that the private and public payers are using. What's your thoughts on that dimension?
Well, I mean, Canada and Ontario is a leader in that. And what we have at the UHN is a kind of a global expert in interoperability. So it's great that that's here in Canada. Unfortunately, while we have the I guess the brain power implementing that, maybe we're a little bit behind some of the other jurisdictions. But I'm pretty bullish on it. And when we developed our software, to the extent that there was standards or interoperable principles that could be used for pretty much every single module that we've built, we've made it that way. And we had to make a core CRM that worked within itself. But even the way that CRM handles like lab data or medication data, it's all based on the standards that are in play today. But then when we started to build the pieces that other people touch, so for example, the piece that the prescribers touch or the piece that the pharmacists touch, we were very careful not to make it work only with our system. Like we made it a separate standalone system. And because we had a CRM system that obviously we had access to, we built it so that it could communicate with that system without having to actually touch that system, because I believe that that's going to be the way of the future. There's going to be standards coming in a lot of different areas. And some of those standards are a few years away and some are 20 years away. But at the end of the day, you need to have software and processes that can interact with anyone who's willing to interact, because that's the way the future is going to be. The second one company gets too big and starts to control everything, it's not great for innovation. And you can see how it's happening in the States. Some of the companies are getting too big and they're already starting to say, hey, we need to break these companies up. So the best way things work most efficiently is when there's open sort of standards that everyone can work with. And then you get innovators to make those standards and to use them better than other people. And then the whole sort of community elevates one step, and then that just keeps happening over and over again.
I absolutely love that. And I think that's just a perfect story, actually, John, for all of the companies that you have founded. It's very much on the premise of that belief system of really maintaining a culture of innovation or ecosystem of that, and then having the resources and the collaborations and partnerships with the companies that want to be able to fund and help and create that. And I think within all of this, we have to realize that data is the new gold. And a lot of companies that are going to be flourishing in the next century are going to be data analytics companies. And we actually didn't get into this, but the whole idea around real world evidence and looking at data and population health management, and companies like yourself being able to retrieve some of these information potentially in the future ambiently. So it may not even be manually entered. It can be just flowing in through the systems that we already use. So it's going to be very interesting. So I think we're at the top of the hour. And again, we could talk about this for many, many days and probably through many conferences, lots of great stuff here. For those of you who are listening to the show today, if you're interested in connecting with John, learning more about what OkRx can do with your company, if you're interested in learning more about this novel way of setting up and establishing your patient support programs, or just learning more about how you might be able to partner, please look for that information in the show notes that will be coming shortly. We also invite you to check out our website at impetusdigital.com. If you were at all interested in this discussion, we invite you to see if you could want to have more of these with people like John and other various stakeholders in a series of asynchronous and synchronous collaborations, talking about these beyond the pill conversations. How are we going to get beyond the fax machine? How are we going to create new protocols so we can change the regulatory environment that we're working in? This is really what Impetus does through our Insight platform. Please feel free to like and subscribe to our channel so you can hear about new items and be able to share this with others. We want to thank everybody for your time today. John, it was absolutely a pleasure speaking with you and wishing everybody a wonderful day ahead.